one, greetings all, and welcome to another episode of 100 Words or Less, the podcast. I'm your host, Ray Harkins. Thank you very much for joining us on this fine afternoon, morning, evening, late night, whenever you're listening to this. Thanks for hanging out. The guest this week is Mike Mowery. He is a very old friend of mine. He works for, actually, I would even technically say runs a management company called Outerloop Management. They have a crap load of bands like We Came as Romans, basically a lot of what's happening on Warped Tour currently. He is the manager for a lot of those bands. He's helping them make decisions. He's helping them kind of usher through their musical careers. And he also played in a hardcore band called Good Clean Fun. And he also put on shows in his living room for years with Steve Aoki, the megastar DJ. Basically, the dude is a Renaissance man. He's intelligent, well put together. I respect him greatly, so I was very excited to have him on this show. More on him in a minute. Let's get some business stuff out of the way. Thanks again to the Native Sound, who sponsored the show for the past month. Great record label. This is a completely free ad, but that's just because I love them. And I love what they're doing. So visit thenativesound.com and you'll be able to check out what they have going on over there. So do that. Propertyofzack.com, our media partners, love having them on board and continually supporting the show. The email newsletter, it's in full swing. We've got like at least 400 or 500 people signed up for this thing, and it's awesome. So thank you very much for showing an interest in that. Basically what I do is every Monday, I'll send you the guest for the upcoming week. I'll give you a little recap on the previous week's show. It's just a way for me to stay in touch with you, a very committed listener, and I appreciate that. It's just another way for us to have dialogue. So go to the website, 100wordspodcast.com, and on the right side, just below the donate button, hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, there is a box where you can type your email address. Super simple. Once a week, boom, you'll get some cool stuff. And I always recommend fun things that I've tripped across, whether it's music, movies, whatever. Just a little recommendation, as it were, because I know a lot of you like and look to the show for recommending you cool stuff. So that's what I'm doing for you. Got to mention some people who have left nice reviews on iTunes. We have Mr. Jitsis from Great Britain. He says, I thoroughly enjoy discovering new people, bands, and artists that I wasn't familiar with before. It's awesome. I love that. When you listen to each episode, not only does it give me the satisfaction of knowing that you are marching through these shows with me, but the fact that, hey, I don't know this band, I don't know this person in particular, but I'm still going to check it out. I love that. It's so cool. And then Jack Chapman, who basically just says, I really, really recommend this podcast. Thank you. I appreciate that. Again, what's up, United States? Where are you guys? Having a lot of love from like the UK. Let's step it up, United States. You know, we're the number one at everything, right? So why not jump onto the iTunes store and leave some reviews? Anyways, for those of you that subscribe to the magazine Alternative Press, I'm in it this month. Thank you very much to Scott Heisel, who asked me a few questions in regards to 5 lessons learned in living this weird music lifestyle business thing that I've been doing for a very long period of time. So he asked me 5 questions or just give 5 recommendations, and I did, and thank you to him for that. So check it out. It's on newsstands for the next 4 weeks or so. And it's always fun to see your picture in a magazine. It's like, oh, wow, that's cool. I'm also going to be going out, like right now, as this episode is probably streaming into your ear holes, I'm on my way to Riot Fest in Chicago. It's an amazing musical event. I personally have never been. This will be my first time. And I'm excited. It's over 3 days in downtown Chicago. Basically every band you've ever heard of. There's like at least 30% of the bands that are playing the festival have been on this show, which is awesome. I'm looking forward to it. Hanging out with friends, hanging out with previous guests of the show. I'm going to let you in on something. So I've had this pipe dream for a long time to have Tony Brummel from Victory Records on this podcast. I'm not going to frame the podcast from a perspective of like, this is going to be a hit piece and, you know, let's talk about all the lawsuits and all the bands that have been quote unquote screwed over, because that is well-traveled territory that has been documented across every single website. Previous employees of Victory Records have spoken out. It's all out there. Me personally, Victory Records was such a huge part of me getting into music that I am so interested in how Tony views the legacy of his label and the kind of character that he is portrayed as. And of course, there's probably some, if not a lot of truth within the character that is portrayed to the general public. But I truly do believe that peeling away a few layers, he feels like he's probably just a hardcore kid that sang for a hardcore band called Even Score. I don't know. I really want to sit down with him and have a honest conversation about, how the label sits in his own head and, where he's at now. And because he just doesn't do interviews. So I'm crossing my fingers that this will come through. I've been emailing with him. He's been responsive, and it's great. So fingers crossed. I'm just letting you a little secret. If it doesn't happen, I apologize, but I am trying my hardest. So anyways, Mike Mowery, like I said, he is a Renaissance man. He is very successful with the management company that he is a part of. It's awesome because, as we will dive into in the interview, a lot of these bands, many of you listeners would listen to them or already previously know them and be like, oh, that band's terrible. Like musically, they don't do anything for me. Whereas they may not do something for Mike as well. I'm just putting words in his mouth. He didn't say this to me. He really views his role as obviously a mentor and a person that's helping a band, kind of guide them through this weird music industry stuff and make hopefully ethical decisions, make decisions that will increase the longevity of bands. And I really respect what he is doing, regardless of if I personally like the bands that he's managing. Like, because that's irrelevant to me. It's like he's doing the right thing as far as I'm concerned. This gives you a lot of background into, how managing bands works and all the intricacies of that. And, a lot of you do look to this podcast for some sort of music industry advice. This is a perfect podcast for that. We'll go through it. So I'll talk to you after we have our conversation with Mike. Personal entry point to you, as it were. Correct me if I'm wrong, because I have no idea exactly when we met, but if my memory serves me right, the first time that we met, I think, was either one of two places. One, we played a show together in a basement of a rich girl's house in New Jersey with Good Clean Fun and Taken, and that was probably, 2001, 2002, or we met way back in the day, and I think this probably was just in passing when you were living in Santa Barbara doing shows at the Pickle Patch.
Either one. Whichever one makes for a better story at this point.
Well, neither of them are stories. When certain people, and I'm sure you experience this yourself, when certain people exist in your life for over 10 years, and someone were to put you on the spot to be like, oh, hey, where'd you guys meet up? You're like, I don't know. Somewhere. Like if someone was like, when did you meet Chris Logan from Chokehold? I'm sure you would have no idea where you'd actually met him.
Right. Yeah. I'd have a general idea, but just like this, it's like we very well probably did meet in Santa Barbara, or at least we're in the same room. We can surely say that. It's funny because even the Good Clean Fun thing with Taken, that you bring that up, I'm like, all right, I guess we met then. But what I think of is really when we started to, kind of formulate, I guess, more of the business relationship, and then started to reflect on, oh, hey, part of the reason why doing business with each other is cool is we both come from the hardcore world.
You actually hit a point I was going to bring up later, but now is as better time as any. Because, especially with what you've done over the past, 7 to 8 years at Outerloop Management, where you are working with bands and artists and a lot of different people that come from so many walks of life that don't have a context for, they have a context for a scene, but they don't have a context for obviously the cloth that we were made from. Is it interesting for you and kind of revelatory at certain moments to be like, oh wow, I gotta back this up because we're coming from two completely different worlds as far as our upbringings are concerned?
A little bit, in all honesty, sometimes I think it might be advantageous that, I think that depending on what you're trying to do in the business, which is what I'm in at this point, I think that, certain things from the hardcore world help and certain things from the hardcore world potentially hinder. And part of that is you run into bands that don't ever have these perceived limits of what their expectations should be, which is great because that's what, my role is and my goal is now with bands is if it's their goal, let's make them as big as possible. And there's no like, oh, you've sold out or, oh, you've eclipsed this certain threshold that, the world that we came from was a very, real limitation to certain bands and certain people, myself included. You know, I spent a lot of time dinking around thinking that the business shouldn't be the business. I cherish those moments. There's times that I wish that this wasn't the business, but now I've moved on and it is the business. And so I've had to, accept that there are certain things that go along with business. I'm just thankful that I get to do it with, music and people that are passionate about what they do as opposed to computer software or something like that.
That's a very good and interesting point, because I think what I've watched you kind of go through and accomplish is you evolve, where it's like, I think a lot of people, that do come from the, especially coming from the the quote unquote Santa Barbara scene, where it was so rooted in the context of Ebullition Records and no barcodes and, like you said, selling out and that sort of stuff. Having been raised in that culture and then having to, like you said, evolve to where it's like, you would never bat an eye at this point on a barcode on a record. Whereas, 15 years ago, it'd be like, oh yeah, that's right. Like, we're not supposed to like that. You've made the transition to willingly go along with this, as opposed to like, oh, whatever. I mean, like you said, I'm sure there were those moments you kind of really wrestled with it. Can you remember those times where you find yourself on the fence, where it's like, oh, I don't know if the music business world is meant for me?
Well, I'll say this: it makes it easier since there are no UPC codes on a downloaded file.
Yes, true, very true.
Crappy joke aside, everything that I've done to where you find me now has been a gradual transition. So it's not like I had to go from underground punk without barcodes is great to, oh my God, now everything has to have a barcode on it. There's such gray transition in each step that I took, from going from there to starting to tour in Good Clean Fun, to tour managing to figuring out, not just, what is a manager's role, and going from managing individual bands to now trying to grow a company and manage that. Like, each step has required me to take further and further kind of progression or leaps. And so consistently along the way, I like to remind myself, fucking Kent McClard and many of the people in Santa Barbara, they have a point, and I'm not in touch with Kent. It was hilarious because when Steve Aoki came to town not too long ago, we were hanging out and talking about Kent, and we were like, hey, maybe the joke's on us. Maybe he's the happiest one, maybe he's the one surfing, riding his mountain bike. But it really is about what you want out of life. And my life has afforded me to do some pretty amazing things, and still affords me to do amazing things, which is why I really enjoy my life. My business is completely intertwined in my life because I think that's the way it has to be, but isn't my life.
Like, I definitely think a lot of people, especially within the context of the music industry, not only from the behind the scenes stuff, but obviously playing in bands, it's hard to remove your identity in regards to, like, you don't get so wrapped up as like, okay, Mike from Outerloop Management, like that's how you're known, and that's like your only, quote unquote claim to fame. And then once you strip that away, it's like, well, what is, who am I? Like, there's that proverbial question that's asked. And I think a lot of people get lost within that identity crisis.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think, the people that ultimately are happy, and, I guess that's one huge factor in success, are people that have figured out how to have a balance in their lives. That's what I've noticed. And, it is tough. It's like I remember when, Facebook first started, and I created a personal account and I created for Outerloop Management account. And it was, I really wanted to try to keep those separate. And what you realize is that's a complete pain in the ass. And there is a lot of overlap. There's plenty of times that I wish that somebody in the business didn't know that, I was doing A, B, C, or D with, my family or with whatever. But I think that's kind of like the normalization of what we expect out of people nowadays is, I sort of respect there's people in our business. There's people that do what I do that have no social media presence or no public social media presence. And I'm kind of like intrigued by that, because I realize that part of my social media presence allows people to think that I'm doing really cool shit. And a lot of times I am doing really cool shit, but there's times that I'm not doing cool shit that then other people think I'm doing cool shit because I make it look that way.
The digital life that is presented, no one is going to dwell in their own misery and post pictures of themselves doing unfun stuff. Like there's totally that context.
Well, there are plenty of people that do that, but they just presumably are fizzled out somewhere and don't. Right. Well, I think part of that is you have to have a resilience to you to do what we do. It isn't easy. You're sitting here at the end of the day, when it's not really the end of the day, but it's the end of the office day, running my hand through my hair because today's been a whirlwind, and there's been amazing things that happened, and there's been some stuff that I never expected to have to deal with that has happened. And there's been some stuff that isn't great that's happened. And that happens all day, every day. That's amazing. But there are times that you just kind of want to be like, cool, I showed up at 9. I read a few emails. I made a few phone calls. I went to coffee with somebody. And then I went home and made dinner and called it a day. But, there's a trade-off to everything. And I'm starting to lose the point of exactly what I was saying.
No. That it's fine. Backing up, you, as you've mentioned before, you were, an Army brat. You were raised in many different places. Where were you actually born, though?
Kentucky, Fort Campbell, Kentucky, down near the Kentucky-Tennessee border. And I lived there for 6 months before I think we moved next to either North Carolina or Georgia, one of the military bases.
What'd your father actually do in the military? If you're at liberty to say.
I mean, it's actually interesting, and this podcast isn't about my dad, but so much of who my dad is, what I've had to figure out is it's made me who I am, and it's made me realize for all of the faults that he has because he's a human, there's so many things that are fantastic about him. The military is such an interesting thing, and I come from a lineage of military people. My mom's father was, a decorated soldier that was in, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. My dad's father was a decorated soldier who was in World War II, Korea, Vietnam. They essentially met because when they were in college, those parents were at the same military base and they were introduced to one another. My mom comes from a family of 5. My dad comes from a family of 6. Every single one of those people has had some stint either in the military or female side. Some of them have been in the military, but if they weren't, they've married somebody in the military. Mm-hmm. My older sister married somebody in the military. So I'm kind of the first to escape, if you will.
That's a huge thing for you to take a step out and not be a part of that. Did that cause a divide within the family?
What's amazing, and this is where I really, looking back, what I completely appreciate about my dad is he supported us no matter whether he agreed with our choice or not. Now, in all honesty, I think he was on the fence about whether he wanted us to follow in his footsteps. I mean, he was a guy, you asked what he did. He was in the infantry. He was in Vietnam, on the ground, being shot at, all of that stuff. Eventually, he transitioned into becoming an aviator, a helicopter pilot.
Okay.
Was in the first Iraq war. Sort of interesting. My sister sent my brother and I a text yesterday. So when my dad was in the first Iraq war, there was a friendly fire incident, and there's not many of those, and they're really frowned upon. That's, our soldiers shooting our own soldiers. The guy who did it under the command of my dad, he was in charge of what's known as a brigade. It's a pretty big organization. And so ultimately, my dad didn't take the blame for doing it, but this guy was under his command, and he therefore took responsibility for what happened. Ultimately, it was a pretty defining time in his career that ended up costing him, a couple promotions. And I think it sort of soured his taste. But, one of the things that he's indicated to me, and this is how I feel like I run my organization is, look, I'm at the top. It's if somebody else does something, I'm not going to hang them out to dry. I'm going to
took the responsibility.
Correct. I'm not saying that that's completely gone from the music business, but it's something that's really important, to me. And so my sister was saying she's a nurse. She works at a hospital near a military base. Woman came in, gave birth, and her father was they started talking about history, blah, blah, blah. And turns out this guy knew my dad. And the text that my sister conveyed was, throughout all of that, your dad, exemplified character beyond what that guy had seen anyone else do. And that's something that I really try to mimic in him.
It's so funny because especially coming from the context of anti-authoritarian, punk rock or hardcore, whatever you want to call it, there's always that, nature to rebel against everything that an established architecture of, the military, police, whatever you want to call it. There's obviously redeeming values and character qualities, like exactly what you're talking about, like, loyalty and responsibility. It's like those things permeate throughout every structure, even though the structure may be flawed. There's good things to be had out of it.
Yeah, I mean, you said it perfectly. I couldn't even attempt to say it as well as you just said it.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, I rebelled. And it was interesting, and it was an interesting time. And I don't think that,
When did you take a step out to like make that declaration that you weren't, going to enlist in the military?
Well, it wasn't necessarily like a choice. It was more like, I had the opportunity. My dad went to West Point, which is the military academy, and I had the opportunity to go there, and I chose not to go there, And I actually was on an ROTC scholarship at college when I first started, and I was doing that to help pay for it. And eventually I knew that it wasn't something that I wanted to do. It was something that I don't know if stood against, but it wasn't something that, I didn't want to follow those footsteps at that point and go into the military. And so that was a very defining moment in my life where I had to tell my dad, hey, it really teaches you about presuming how somebody's going to react. Because the reaction was actually much better than I had ever hoped for. It was, hey, look, in all honesty, I don't know if the military is the best place for people. It's a great thing. My dad believes that the military protects our country, that America is, not, again, this doesn't need to be so much about my dad, but it was eye-opening to me. And it's been such an integral part of the foundation of my relationship with him, is that he said, I'm not always going to agree with what you choose, but I'm going to support you.
And that's honestly, from a generational perspective, that's not common.
Correct.
Like, or if it is, if that does exist, that takes like a father 20 years to come to that point of like,
Yeah.
Okay, well, whatever. I guess like now your dad may be coming around like, I guess Mike's doing okay. Like,
well, definitely. He's helped me, with leadership things within my organization, because again, the military, teaches you leadership. I'm here trying to manage, a staff of 10 plus people. This is a guy who in a brigade is in charge of however many that is, 1,000, let's say. I haven't had any formal training in that regard. It's sort of been learn as you go. That's the ultimate irony of a bunch of us, punk dudes that ended up where we ended up. You don't have the training. You don't necessarily have the skill set or have the knowledge base to do what we do. You figure it the F out.
You don't go to school for it. You just you learn by doing and failing, then putting it together because you've failed so many times before.
Not sure if that's the best way to do it necessarily.
Yeah. No.
In hindsight, maybe I would have wanted a little bit more formal training or whatever.
Yeah, maybe I should have taken some of these classes. After you became introduced to punk and hardcore, and that started to kind of really seep through your life. Did you have a path that you wanted to go on in regards to you obviously said, okay, West Point in the military isn't my thing. What was your sights set on as far as what you felt like you wanted to do?
It was so unclear. The only family members that we had that weren't military people were engineers, and I was good at math and I was good at science, so I decided I'd become an engineer. And 2 years into engineering school, I'm getting straight A's, but I'm miserable because I couldn't see where I wanted to be. And part of that was the energy of punk and hardcore and this exploration of a world, a livelihood with meaning and a culture with meaning and, an introduction to all of these radical ideals. And so I kind of peeled away from that and quit going to college, dropped out, I guess, is the term that people use, and wasn't sure
Yes.
if I was going to go back. I was in Atlanta. I was at Georgia Tech, and I decided I took a trip to California for the very first time. very first time as an adult. We went there once through my dad's military career. We ended up in Washington State. There's a base there called Fort Lewis, and there's one trip where, it's often rainy up there, and my dad decided that one weekend we'd drive south until we found the sun. And I don't know exactly where we got, but we were in Northern California. We hadn't found the sun yet, and he had to be back at work within, however many hours it was going to take to drive back. So we drove back without finding the sun. That had been my one previous trip to California. So I went to California, through my connections with punk and hardcore and the Santa Barbara scene, went out there, fell in love with it, obviously, because what's not to fall in love with
California,
with California when when you've lived in all these other, kind of weird military based places. And I decided I'd move there. And once Isla Vista in particular is much different than the school year. The summer, everybody's kind of goofing off. Maybe they're working part-time, what have you. And during the year, probably not working part-time. People are going to school. And when I got there and I was working a 9 to 5, and I was watching all these people that are going to class a couple hours a day, if even, and, it just seemed like they were having a better life. And I was like, whoa. I didn't move to California to just, work at Kinko's. Yeah, this ain't happening. And so figured out how I could transfer in to find a degree, all of my credits, to find a degree that I thought fit some of my ideals, but also would get me out of school the quickest, because I didn't want to stay in. I didn't want to incur a ton of debt.
Sure.
I wanted to get out,
Get your business done, move on.
Yeah. So I got an environmental science degree and actually thought I was going to become an environmental scientist.
Okay. And something that I look back at that time, because the only reason I was spending time in Santa Barbara is because I was dating a girl that lived up there. That year and a half that I was going, basically every other weekend I was up there. And then once I, tripped on the pickle patch, because she was staying at like the freshman dorms, and then she stayed like honestly right down the street from the pickle patch. I know it's probably difficult to, encapsulate, but, in your own words, like describe the pickle patch, because it was such it's rare to see those things exist now. Just because there's obviously either less bands that are concerned about sort of the house show scene, or it's just difficult to find spots that can last for a long time. So describe the pickle patch to me, Mike.
I mean, it was a square living room that was able to fit, bands and anywhere from, 10 to 75 people, depending on how big or small the people were. To stuff in there. But it's insane. It's such a rare thing if you look back on it. But it was a space that we lived upstairs, and downstairs was a living room, and we'd gladly move the furniture out. Thank God. In, California, it rarely rains, and we'd bring the touring bands in, no matter how big or how small. Whoever showed up would pay the small door price, and all of that money would go to the bands, and they'd be on their merry way with anywhere from $5 to $500, usually on the lower side.
I'm sure you look back at that time obviously fondly, but then I'm sure it is weird for you to have perspective on something that it's very rare to have a shared space where so many people have so many different memories attached to it, and on top of that, have it also be a music venue. Yeah,
I think so. I think there's more of them than we're kind of giving credit for. I do think that there are a lot of those spaces in that time, and there very well may be some in this time that we're just not aware of, because I'm surely not in touch with that world so much. But yeah, I look back on it incredibly fondly.
That was the inception of your of Fight Records as well, because you were doing that. Did you start doing that when you were in Santa Barbara, or did that predate going to Santa Barbara?
It sort of was very much at the same time. The first couple bands that I released, or the very first release, was an Atlanta band, because that's where I was based. And then once I decided to move to California, the second release was a Santa Barbara band. And, I think the idea of it was spawned in Atlanta. Some other friends of mine and I had done a label together, and we put out one compilation. Then we all sort of split our ways. And so it didn't make sense to carry that name over. And so started up Fight Records.
You put out what, less than 30 releases, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Close to that, but not quite that.
Yeah. And was it just a matter of it petered out because you were just like, I don't have the time or attention span to be able to do this? And also the finances, probably.
A little bit of it, there's a number of factors, and one large factor, I moved to DC when ISA was starting Good Clean Fun, or really turning it into like a touring operation. And I was trying to get out of Santa Barbara. It had worn its welcome. I'd finished school and stayed a couple more years to do pickle patch stuff and work and search for our environmental jobs and do a little bit of touring here and there. But, it was obvious that Isla Vista in particular was a spot that really is for college kids. So I was looking for, a way to move on, and ended up in DC, and, in the ever interesting life of a guy trying to spend as little money possible, but do as many things as possible. I stored a ton of my records in, the basement of a recording studio that some friends had just taken over. And at some point while we were on tour, that basement flooded severely, and I ended up losing a ton of stuff, catalog, yada, yada, yada. So that was one part. Another part of it was it sort of, I was touring all the time towards the end of that. And, this was the 2000s. So we had, I think we had some cell phones by then. We surely had email, but it was a different email than we all have today at the, touch of our fingers. And so it was pretty much a combination of things, but it very much felt like it was time to kind of put it down.
For years, you traveled with International Noise Conspiracy at pretty much the height of their career, doing tour managing. You'd obviously known Dennis from Refused and stuff like that, but was it one of those things that you just kind of got thrown in there as just like Mike's a good guy, like let's travel with him, he seems responsible, and then you just kind of started taking on more responsibility as things kept going?
Yeah, more or less. My buddy Jason Hamaker from Frodis was supposed to do the tour management gig. Really the pitch was drive the band between DC, New York, and Boston for CMJ, whatever year that was, 99, I think. And Jason was unfortunately dealing with a personal matter, and he couldn't travel. And I was I knew Dennis as well. So Jason was like, hey, maybe Mike can do it. He's got a van. We had the Good Clean Fun van. What I signed up for was to do these 3 shows, which then turned into, a full US tour. And all of a sudden I went from, in my mind, the friend helping out, really the guy driving, to something I'd never known before, which was a tour manager. I thought that was the bass player or the drummer,
Right.
The one guy in the band that really has no talent, but serves his purpose by, stepping up and handling the logistics.
Right. Was that a really weird experience for you as it started to, unfold, and obviously all the, world tour craziness started to happen with the band, where it was like, oh wow, like you kind of got a front row seat on sort of how a band operates on, kind of each level as they grow?
Yeah, definitely. And it was thrilling in a lot of ways. And I really liked the business side of it, of the tour management. It wasn't anything that I'd truly focused on, and it was interesting, and that's almost like looking back on it, that I enjoyed that business part of it. It was more so, I was bringing over, 5 Swedes, most of whom hadn't done a U.S. tour. That's actually not fair to say. Both Dennis and Sarah had done U.S. tours, but hadn't done it as a group. And, the first few tours, everyone was vegan, everyone was straight edge. And we, it was almost like playing tour guide, going to city, finding, like back then it was the one good vegan restaurant in any city, finding that, eating at it, going to the show, hanging out, it was awesome. And then that started to expand a little bit to the world, again, sort of each step of the way. more and more business bits came up and things that I was handling and thinking of. And, you go from a van to a bus to, this to that. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, I'm really dealing with
so much stuff.
Yeah. In all honesty.
Because usually, like you were alluding to earlier in regards to, there's that, usually you have the sort of business dude in the band that usually, likes that role. So did you find yourself identifying with the business stuff? Kind of, I wouldn't say immediately, but you found yourself enjoying that aspect of it?
Yeah. I mean, it was, in hindsight, it was always what I was interested in. It was my contribution to music, no matter what. I was either putting on the shows, trying to do the zine, trying to do the record label in Good Clean Fun, handling the booking and the business component of it. And so it was just a very natural transition.
Did you play in a band prior to Good Clean Fun? Because you never had something kicking around when you were in Santa Barbara, did you?
No. Mm-mm.
Okay, that's what I thought. It's strange where it's like, to me, looking at you, it's like, oh yeah, your first band was Good Clean Fun, even though you had existed in the quote unquote scene for quite some time.
Yep.
Yeah. Yep. That was it. As International Noise Conspiracy started to, slow down and the touring commitments that you had started to, kind of dissipate. Was there ever any of those transitional moments that you felt like, in a similar way where obviously like a band starts to slow down and then the members have to collectively figure out what they're doing with their lives? Did you ever feel those transitional moments either in between before you joined up with International Noise Conspiracy or as stuff started to slow down with them of like holy crap, what am I going to do?
Yeah. I mean, it was really when they started to slow down because there was a time when I was doing Good Clean Fun and tour managing, and we were really fitting those schedules around one another. More so, I knew what International Noise Conspiracy was going to do, and that was what was starting to pay me. And then, Good Clean Fun, which at that point had started to subside a little bit. But I mean, there's a very distinct moment in my mind where, Noise Conspiracy had, there was a break between, I can't remember exactly, what was causing that break, but they'd kind of taken a little bit of time off, and I had to, come home and try to figure out here I am, what am I going to do with my life? And it already started to have these, tour management is great, but ultimately you are helping individuals and bands, try to achieve their goals. And, I was sacrificing a number of things on my own in order to do that. And so I started to have these thoughts of, okay, how can I not be so much involved with this? And so at one point I was in DC, and, there was a job for an outdoor educator. And, I did this whole outdoor education, like apprenticeship and then curriculum, which was really fascinating and was a ton of fun. And I gained a lot of great friends through that. But ultimately, Noise Conspiracy got signed to American and made a record with Rick Rubin. And here I am sitting here like, okay, this job is cool and all, but here's this band that really has the shot to explode or sign to, this major label. I'm the guy that's been there for 5 years, hoofing it with them, sleeping on floors, sharing hotel beds, waking up, super early for European festival flights, all of the grind, if you will. And if they're going to pop and it's going to be a ride, I want to be there for the ride. And yeah, I'll tour manage it, but like, I don't want to miss out on the party. Party never materialized.
Yeah, the invites were sent out, but then it never happened.
And for all of them, I'm sure it was, much harder. They put the emotional investment into the record itself. At least I didn't do that, but and so then it was, okay, how do I transition out of this? I'd already been sort of having these misgivings about wanting to continue to tour. I want to be able to achieve some goals within my own life. What is my next step from here? And, that's when I get a phone call from Mike from Darkest Hour, who says, hey man, we got Ozfest. What do we do?
Right. Which is perfect.
I mean, it's pretty perfect. It's funny to look back on that time and, think like, wow, there was underground bands, I guess, had managers. I mean, I don't know. I'd have to look back, who managed Pennywise or who managed these punk bands back in the day. But this situation of hardcore guys playing metal, that transitioning into melodic metalcore created a lot of careers for people.
I know it's really interesting you mentioned that whole management thing, because I distinctly remember the feeling of bands in the late, I mean, when Taken existed in the late 90s, early 2000s, the feeling was that like, oh dude, you don't need a manager. I just remember it's like certain band, a band like Atreyu from here in Southern California, when they were working with Tim Smith. And it was one of those things where it was like, it was such a foreign idea. And so like, even, moving on a few years from that, the idea of like a band like Darkest Hour needing management kind of being like, I guess that makes sense. Sure, I'll do it.
Well, completely. And, a huge part of it for them was, hey, a manager is this guy who comes in and takes your money, and
Totally.
and we trust you and we like you and we know you'll do a good job. And if there's any money to be made, I guess, we're okay with you making it. Joke was on me was, was there really money to be made? Is there money to be made, Ray? I'm not so sure.
Right.
That was the intro to management. And so Mike from Darkest Hour, who is, just one of the greatest people in the entire world, and he's such a social bee and a connector, was like, hey, you're in DC. Last I checked, there aren't a bunch of managers in DC, but our attorney's here. You should talk to him. And so, I was like, yeah, I mean, I know a little bit about management, but let me go talk to this guy. And so he had just helped a bunch of bands do record deals. So you had bands like Strapping Young Lad, you had Misery Signals, you had the Agony Scene, you had, that was kind of really the first, Reflux. They'd done record deals, and then all these, once the deal signed, these guys turned around to him and said, okay, now what? And so we had a discussion, and I was like, okay, here's somebody that knows way more about these contracts than I know, who knows, has got contacts that I don't have. I got the street smarts, I mean, literally from touring. And we said, hey, let's manage these bands. That's really how it started.
It's true, that notion of okay, where do we go from here? Because it wasn't common. Like it's common now for bands that have 3 songs up on a Bandcamp to have a manager. And like, and that idea is still, I mean, you chuckle and I chuckle at it. And it's like, it's funny because you're just like, well, you don't need a manager. It's like, calm down. But then, yeah, when bands execute deals like that at that weird time of like, oh, we got the deal on our own, but then where do we go from here? And it's like, that's a perfect solution that you guys were presenting, where it's like, oh yeah, we can help you, after this deal is done, just talk to Mike and we'll see you through this.
And so that was the infancy of it. And there was one other guy, Derek, who's still with me today, who he and Jeff's the attorney, he and Jeff had known each other for sort of the same reason. Derek was helping out a band from the area. He knew Jeff and knew that Jeff had legal experience, and they had connected. And so, the 3 of us decided, all right, hey, let's form a company. Jeff had some real business experience, more so than really Derek or I. And that was it.
Yeah. And then and it takes you to here. You hit on a notion earlier that I want to talk about again, was the balance between obviously life and work, when your life is your work and it all kind of, your friends are directly related to everything that you do. And knowing that, you yourself, have a wife, you're creating a family and all that sort of stuff. And then on that same notion, you're being a boss now, or you are obviously, supervising people. And, no one when they're 22 years old is like, dude, I can't wait to be a boss. I can't wait to tell people like what to do. So it's kind of a 2-part question, but the idea of, the balance that you try to create, like, do you have to draw these definitive lines in the sand of like, all right, dude, like, man, I have to check out during these times. Like the weekend is, Saturday is my sanctuary as long as, a band isn't breaking down, like please don't call me or whatever. What sort of methods have you used personally to kind of navigate that, especially now, like I said, that you are, trying to plant the roots, so to speak?
Oh, I'm terrible at it. And, the only way that I've been able to do it is to try my hardest to hire people to help me deal with the minutia of, working with bands, which is incredibly important, and it's super important to the bands and it's super important to us. But I've done a lot of that in my time and want to have a different relationship with the bands as well as, my life. It's hilarious that you asked that, because I often find myself working on the weekends. It's not the same thing. It's not the day to day. It's not, okay, I'm going to call this guy and follow up with things. But I find when I'm taken out of that, able to be most creative. And so, when my mind is free on the weekend, and if I think of an idea, I'm the one emailing it around. Now, there's not the expectation that somebody responds to me, but, we do very much live in this day and age of, if it's on your mind, you send it out, whether that be a tweet, or an email. And so I'm actually relatively bad at that in some ways myself. But, there has to be a balance. People do need to recharge and refresh. And, I used to just go. And I still do that a lot. But I have found that I have to take time away, from it. And the tricks I've used is turn my phone off, which at least 1 week a year, I will now gladly go somewhere with my phone off. You can reach the people who work with me, and that's not, and I'm confident that the people who work with me can handle any problem that comes up within a week. We're not planning your career in that week. We're not, doing A, B, C, or D that is super important to a band, handling the issues that may arise. And, I got a lot of talented people here that can handle issues probably better than I can.
Sure. And so do you find that you're, how long have you been married now?
Geez, Ray, that's a hard, no, 4 years as of July. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So did you find yourself that when you have another person being like, yo, knock it off, like not in a nagging sense of the way, but just in a, hey, like I'm here to help your mental health. Like, do you find that's helped?
I mean, a little bit. I think my wife sees how passionate I am and sees how driven I am. And I'm hoping that's one of the things that made me attractive to her, was that I do have a very strong drive and a very, strong will to achieve and succeed. I mean, there is that notion, and this is one thing that she does a good job of reminding me of, is just because you're busy doesn't mean that you're being effective. It doesn't mean that you're, accomplishing things. Just because you're on your phone doesn't, and so try to pick the quality times to be on. I mean, again, that's something that I sort of struggle with from time to time, but surely try to implement those things and find ways to carve out time to, to spend time, whether it's with her, whether it's with good friends, whether it's, whomever. But on the flip side of that, and this kind of goes back to something that we were talking about earlier, it's like the life that I've created, part of the constant accessibility or need to be accessible, but also having the technology to be accessible allows me to have a lot of freedom, even if, that freedom comes with a small leash attached to it. I can, travel more. Presumably somebody could have 30 years ago or 20 years ago, because they're missing valuable phone calls and, methods of communication. I've got the majority of it in the palm of my hand. And whether I'm doing that, a hike in, Vancouver or my office in DC, does it really matter?
The last thing I wanted to hit on was you accomplished something that I really, not only look up to myself, but really strive to not be shut off to certain things that are happening, obviously of the moment from a music scene, so to speak, where it's like, you look at a band like We Came as Romans, and who are massively successful, are legitimate human beings, And, they're doing something that, whatever, 10 to 15 years ago, you probably wouldn't identify with on a musical level. Remove everything else. But I think a lot of people, like, they can't get over certain hurdles of being from like two disparate scenes. And like something that I've noticed in doing this podcast for as long as I have, it's like people that it may seem like they're from two different worlds are kind of similar in a certain sense. The whole idea of you kind of trying to be not only a manager but obviously a mentor, to where it's like you can take pieces of these ethics that you've obviously been raised with and learned from all the stuff that we were talking about earlier, and then like obviously being able to showcase it to other people to be like, oh yeah, like you can be a ethical band, like you can like care about stuff. So do you notice yourself having to not having to, but deciding to kind of be like, oh hey, and not like old man nostalgia, but like, hey, like this is how I've done it in the past, and maybe we should make this right decision just because it's right, rather than it's going to be a good financial move or whatever?
Well, definitely. I mean, that's really, I think, one of the foundations that I try to employ. And I don't know if it's, based off of the world that I came from, or just, I think that good business is done each decision at a time, and making the hard but sometimes right decision based on what is good for long-term business, as opposed to what's good for, immediate financial gain. And, I've watched other people not do that, and sometimes they have success as well, but it's really about what your goals are. I'm trying to build something here. And I think that's what the hardcore community really did a good job of instilling. It was, DIY. I don't think that everyone that works with me has to be DIY, obviously, because then they'd all be doing it themselves as opposed to doing it with me. But, I refuse to become jaded, and I'm so happy I've transitioned into working with bands that are so far from, the world that, the hardcore and punk world, the music that we were all, so gung-ho about, because it has allowed me and made it so I can't become jaded. And if I think back, what I loved about punk and hardcore was it really connected people, before the internet, before whatever. There was a time in the late 80s when if I had a Youth of Today shirt on and you had a Youth of Today shirt on, we were talking.
Yeah.
We were going, we might not become best friends. That was a conversation starter. And what I liked is I like people. I genuinely do. And that's why I really love what I do. When I work with a band, I like to connect with those people. The music is, brought us to that meeting point. And so that's what, in that mentorship role, it's really not so much about the music itself. You don't find me too often telling old war stories about when I was there, we did this versus that, because it really is two different worlds 9 times out of 10. What I find myself doing is talking about characteristics that I think make up good people, and trying to inspire the individuals and the bands as a whole to, as you said, kind of make the right decision. There's times I'm successful and there's times I'm not.
Right. Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I think that's a really, really potent way of looking at something like that. It's like, it's really easy, even if you are still so connected to the music industry, it's easy, like you said, to become jaded and to be, care about only what you were brought up with or whatever. Or on the flip side, if you are completely disingenuous to yourself and are just like, oh, let me like take care of these bands because they'll make money for me for like 2 years, and then that's kind of it. Because you kind of see right through that from a music industry perspective, where it's like, oh yeah, clearly the only reason they're working with this band is because they have dollar signs attached to them immediately.
I understand the point you're making, but I don't think that is, I think there's a gray area there, because I surely seek opportunities at this point to work with artists that I think can generate money. I run a business. It doesn't mean that that's the only involvement that you want to have. And part of it is, my goal is to be in business with good people. And whether it's the bands themselves, I mean, there's the whole other layer of all of the, as you say, behind the scenes people, and you find yourself gravitating towards certain ones. It's been interesting. It's been a 10-year ride so far. And I've gone, there was people I thought were going to be standing by my side through thick and thin that weren't. There's people that I was alienated from that I've had the pleasure of, proving myself to them or them proving themselves to me, and us having to, move past arguments in the past. And it really is just such a fascinating life.
It definitely is interesting, especially to see people that, there's a difference between, a job and obviously a career. And I think it's like the people that filter in and out of the music industry. It's like, yeah, it's just a job because it looks cool. It's like, oh yeah, all this stuff looks cool. But then when, the rubber hits the road, it's like, oh, this actually is hard. Like this takes actual skill and work.
Yeah. And that's, I think that more and more so it's hard. It's a challenge. It's probably one of the hardest things I've ever done. And sometimes you wake up in the middle of the night, or you're dealing with something hard and you're like, why have I chosen this? Why do I continue to do this? And then you get inspired by, something. I make it a point to go see the bands that I work with live and go connect with them and watch them play, because whether they're playing, the music I love or not, I am inspired by that. A good performance makes me excited. It makes me want to figure out how that particular band can be shared with more people. And so there's always that balance. And, at this point, I don't know anything else, but you talk to other people. I mean, jobs are jobs, careers are careers, and there's upsides to, there's positive components to them and there's negative components to them just the same. You just got to figure out what positives you really want to exacerbate and what negatives you're willing to deal with.
Well, Mike, I really appreciate you hanging out with me. We could go on for another 2 hours like we usually do when we talk. But, I think that would probably be prudent to not do that.
Yeah, we'll have to have part 2 in another year or two, please.
No.
This has been awesome. It's been a real pleasure. I'm flattered that you asked me to be a part of it.
So there we go. That was Mike. Like I said in the interview, I really respect him. I look up to him. He's one of those people that I look up to, and I'm like, I define his path through the music industry as successful and varied and a lot of different experiences, and it's cool. Like that's essentially what our lives are, just kind of collecting a bunch of different experiences and hopefully enjoying most of them. So yes, thank you to Mike for appearing on the show. Tom Richfield, our best buddy and producer of the show. He did it this time. He's doing it forever. He's sided the show for the rest of his life. I hope he knows that. Visit the website, 100wordspodcast.com. Visit propertyofzach.com. And the guest next week, I am super, super excited to bring this one to you. Honestly terrified of doing this interview. And not terrified that this person is intimidating, but terrified because, man, he's a pro. So his name is Dan Carlin. He hosts a podcast called Hardcore History and Common Sense. This dude is so smart when it comes to history. He's doing 4-hour shows on Genghis Khan, like stuff that is so ingrained in our brains from history classes. He's able to describe the context in which these historical figures have been living, and just it's so damn good. So I heard him talk about punk at some point, and I was like, this guy, I think he's on our level. I think he's part of our club, so to speak. So I asked him, and he was more than excited to talk about music, so it was awesome. So I'm bringing you that conversation next week. Like I said, I'm really excited, and I hope that even if you are not aware of his podcast, you will love to hear about the late 70s, early 80s punk scene from his eyes. Super interesting to talk to a person who, generationally speaking, is from a different era of the style of music. So anyways, all that aside, thank you for hanging out, and until next week, be safe, everybody.